Computer. Okay. This is a shir on Likutei Sichos, book, I think 27, Chelek of Zion, Vayikra, the second Sicha of the Vayikra. So it's the beginning of the third book of the Torah, a new book, and obviously, therefore, it's also a new book in Likutei Sichos. And we are going to take a journey today, not just to talk about sacrifices, which is the topic of the entire book, third book of the Torah, which is also called Torat Kohanim, the book of the Kohanim, because the Kohanim and the priests are the ones that have to offer up the sacrifices. But we're actually going to talk about also something much more practical and personal, and that is how we sacrifice ourselves. In what way that can actually be practical even in our daily lives. So let's hold you a little bit in suspense, because let's go through the Sikha the way that Rabbi teaches it. Paragraph 1. In the end of the laws of Isurei Mizbeach, which literally means those things that are forbidden to be offered on the Mizbeach, so the Rambam has a set of halachas. A book is called Karbonos, the laws of Karbonos, and then one of the sets of halachas is the things that are forbidden to bring on the altar. After the Rambam says, and related things. So here the Rambam speaks about the meal offerings, and he speaks about which oil. Meal offering consisted of fine flour together with oil, but which oils were kosher to be used as the offering of the meal offering. He discusses several types of oil. Basically, there's three levels in oil. There's the first squeeze, a more gentle squeeze, where the first drops of oil that comes out is considered the most pristine, the most high quality. Then there's a greater level of crushing, and then there's a third level of crushing. Those are the three levels of oil that can be extracted. We're talking here purely olive oil. And then within the olives themselves, there's three levels of olives. So each of the three levels of olives has three levels of oil that can be extracted from it. The level of olives depends on the proximity, depends on the positioning in the olive tree. So basically, it comes out, you have 9 kinds of oil. And there's the lowest of the low, then there's the highest of the high. So after the Rambam says that all of those variations and grades of olive oil are acceptable for use in the meal offerings in the Mizbeach, the Rambam then continues in a separate halacha, and he says like this: since all of them are kosher to be used for the meal offering, so why does the halacha, the Gemara and the Mishnah, why do they enumerate and specify the exact levels and different grades? What's the difference? If it's olive oil, it's kosher. Why do you have to tell us that there's 9 different grades? But the reason we're told that is so you should know which is the highest grade, that there's nothing above it. What is the absolute AAA grade? And then you should know the middle class, and then you should know the lowest grade. Why would you want to know the different levels? Because if somebody wants to bring merit upon himself, what he should do is bend his impulse, his negative impulse, to skimp, to save, or not spending so much on a sacrifice. So to bend that instinct that he has, the negative instinct of self-preservation in the sense of not wanting to spend, and broaden his hand and bring for his sacrifice from the most beautiful, from the most praiseworthy that exists in that species. And continues the Rambam, the Torah tells us from the very beginning of creation that Hevel, the two brothers, Cain and Abel, that Hevel brought from the firstborns of his flocks and from the choice ones, and Hashem turned to Hevel and to his choice offerings. In other words, because he brought from the best. And similarly, this is also with everything, continues the Rambam, that you do in the name of the good, literally the good Lord, Hakel Hatov, the good Hashem who is good, that you should bring it from what is beautiful and good. If you build a shul, if you build a house of prayer, it should be more beautiful than the house in which you live. When you give a person who is hungry to eat, so it's a charitable hosting, give him from the most sweet and the best that you have at your table. When you're helping a poor person cover over their nakedness, you're clothing somebody in need, give him from the best clothing you have. When you are bringing something to make it holy to Hashem in the Beis Hamikdash, bring from the most beautiful, from the best quality in your possession. And so it says in the fourth book of the Torah, it says, Kol chaylev la Hashem. All the fats should be given to Hashem. In other words, what you give to Hashem should be from the choice, the fat. Today, fat is almost a dirty word for many people. Fat, low fat. We want low fat, but fat means the choice, the succulent, the best quality. So here we have to understand. This law seems to be a very generic and very basic concept in Yiddishkeit. You want to bring something to holiness, do it from the best. But this law is so generic and so central that Rambam already it's not the first time that Rambam says it. In the beginning of this very chapter, the Rambam says it a little bit differently. The Rambam says like this: not everything that is not disqualified should you bring. In other words, just because I said it's not disqualified, that doesn't mean that that's what you should bring. It could be it's not disqualified, but it's actually lousy. But whatever you bring for a carbon, you should bring from the choice, says the Rambam. And where do we learn this from? We learn this from a pasuk that it says, Mivchar nidorecha, you should bring from the choice of the things you promise. So, why does the Rambam then create a new halacha? If the Rambam already says, not just because it's acceptable, it's at the level of acceptability, should you bring it? No, you should try and bring something nicer, even way beyond just the level of acceptability. So the Rambam already said at the beginning of the chapter. Why does the Rambam now say it in such an elaborate way in the halacha that we've just focused on at the beginning of this paragraph? Another question is, that this law that the Rambam just told us, he derives not from a verse, he derives from the fact that our sages took the pains to elaborate to us the 9 levels of oil. So that teaches us, he wants to tell us that there's levels you should know because you want to aim for the highest level to bring of yourself more. So that's why does the Rambam have to introduce that? It's a basic concept he's already said. Number 2, the Rambam in this law that we're discussing says if somebody wants to bring meritoriousness to himself, bring from the best. Earlier the Rambam just said it simply. Don't just bring what's acceptable, bring the best. Now he seems to add some more, flesh it out. Well, why? What's the need for that? And number 3, in the halacha we're discussing, he brings from the story of Hevel, right? He brings another verse that says everything that you bring to Hashem should be chaylev, should be from the fat. So why does the Rambam need to add? Why is what he said at the beginning of the chapter not enough? He says, even though it's acceptable, you should try and bring something choice. Paragraph 2. So you could seemingly say that the reason that the Rambam says it this way is because when you talk about bringing from the choice, there's several levels. As we can infer from the Rambam itself, there's something below carbon on them is as there is a lower level when we speak about bringing choice, bringing something that's good quality to Hashem. There's a level lower. The lowest level is that it's not choice enough to bring. It's forbidden. Even though it may not be a balmul, it may not have an open deficiency, it may not be missing a limb, it may be a complete animal, but still it may not cross over into the threshold of acceptable for carbon. Like the Rambam says in this set of laws, that there are 4 kinds of sicknesses that create that take the animal away from the threshold of being acceptable, because it's not considered choice. One of them, the examples are, for example, if the animal has in the white of his eye a scab that's not growing hair, or if his the horns of the cow were were cut off. There are some things that while it doesn't create a deficiency in terms of a lack of limb, which would be totally forbidden to bring as a sacrifice if the animal is lacking a limb. But even if it's a complete animal, there are still some things that would render it not acceptable. It doesn't cross the threshold of being a properly choice animal. So that's the lowest. So in other words, the lowest level, which we're not even discussing here, is when it's missing a limb or something. Then it's not even a complete animal. Forget that doesn't even come into the discussion. When we bring a complete animal, there's a kind that, let's say, has a scab on the white of the eye, which makes it the animal's complete animal, true, but it doesn't fit the criteria of being something choice. Okay, go up one level. There's a kind of choice which is not just that it doesn't have, let's say, a scab in the eye or those other things which we said makes it not choice, but maybe there's a weakness. Maybe it's a skinny, scrawny animal. Everything's intact. You can't point to anything in particular that says that this animal is lacking, but it's a scrawny animal. It's a weak animal. That's not good and beautiful. So there it's not choice. You shouldn't bring that, but if you did, it would be okay. But the Rambam says about that, just because it's permissible, just because it meets the threshold of acceptable, that's not what you should bring. Because if somebody does that, he says, look, I brought something, don't tell me it's not a good one. Show me where it's not good. And the Kohen says, no, you're right. Chapter, verse, this is acceptable. But you know what it says about such a person, says the Rambam? That cursed is to be somebody who's deceitful. He's kind of, it's kind of, he's using all the loopholes. He found a scrawny animal for cheap. It technically meets all the requirements. It has enters a threshold, but it's not a nice offering to bring. Right? So that's the next level choice up. As we understand also from the Rambam, who says in other sets of laws, that somebody who has donated an ox or a ram or a lamb or a kid goat, he shouldn't bring the weakest one that he can find of that species. But he also doesn't have to bring the absolute top level, grade AAA, the fattest, most beautiful animal either. He can bring something, mid-level, intermediate level. However, if he did bring something scrawny, as long as it doesn't have any of the missing limbs and doesn't even have the things that we said, those other sicknesses like a scab in the eye, which would make it not, which would take it away from the threshold of being considered something choice. So that's it. If he brings something even low grade, he's okay, but he shouldn't. The person should try and aim at the middle, at least the middle level. And there, the Rambam doesn't speak about bringing the absolute best. The Rambam just says, don't bring something that's acceptable but low level. Now the Rambam, so we could say that the Rambam's talking levels. He says the first level is what's forbidden because it's missing limbs. Forget about that. We're not talking about that. Then there's the next thing, which technically is a complete animal, but there's some problem with it that makes it unacceptable. Not because the animal is not a complete animal, because there is a bottom line that it has to be at least to be considered choice in some way. But then when you look at that animal, it could be its choice technically, but there's an overall energy to this animal, which is it's pretty scrawny. It's pretty weak. So the Rambam goes up and says you should bring something nice. We didn't yet speak about bringing the nicest. Now the Rambam goes up one level in the halacha we started our sikha with, and he says like this. The Rambam says a new thing. If somebody wants to really make merit for himself, then he should push as hard as he can to overcome his reticence, to overcome his resistance to bringing something really nice, and he should bring something really nice. Expand, bring something expansive, bring something expensive, bring from the best he possibly can find. Not just something that's not scrawny, not just something intermediate, but go for the gold standard. So that we could say that Rambam, that's why the Rambam teaches this halacha separately, because it's a new thing. He's saying, besides for acceptable and besides what's respectable, which is to bring something middle class, he says, go for the gold. Push yourself. Spend on Hashem. It may not be easy for you to do naturally because people have this tendency to worry if they're going to spend too much, what's going to be. There's a frugality that sometimes seeps into our mindset, but get the best. And this the Rambam learns not from where it says in the Torah mivcha that you have to bring the choice, because bringing a choice, intermediate can also be considered choice. But he learns from the fact that our sages took so much pains to count out the levels of all the grades of the oils. And from the fact that Hevel brought something really choice. And from the fact that the Torah says all things you bring to Hashem should be chaylev, fat. And from this, the Rambam learns, and by the way, this is not just for animals, but anything you do for Hashem, got to do for the best you can. So it's not just the verse that says, bring your choice animals, but the Rambam brings also from the fact that the oil is being counted in terms of grades, from the fact that Hevel is being praised by Hashem, that Hashem turns to him because he brought choice, and from the fact that it says anything you bring to Hashem should be fat, should be good. And this seems to be indicated in the language of the Rambam as well. The Rambam says, since they're all kosher for bringing to the meal offering, all grades of olive oil, why did we count the different grades? Which, if you look at the Rambam and you try and analyze his language, it's not understood. And the Rambam already says that earlier the Rambam says, even though they're all kosher for bringing meal offering, any kind of oil, but the top level oil, nothing is better than it. The first press of the best oil, nothing better than it. Then there's a second level. So we understand. The Rambam already basically laid out. He's telling us top level because we want to bring choice, bring the top. Why does the Rambam then teach the next halacha in a way of question? Why did our sages count out all the different grades? We know why. So for this we understand that in order to bring something choice, you don't have to know all the different levels. Because really when you're saying bring something choice, it doesn't necessarily mean AAA. It just means don't bring something that's below the level of respectable. It doesn't mean you have to bring the absolute AAA. But the Rambam now says, so if really, based on all the things I've taught you till now, says the Rambam, you have to bring something choice, which means it's not, remember we went up the totem pole, now the Rambam says, but still, that would be enough. We don't need to know all the distinctions of the oil. All we need to know is bring a good oil. Why do we go through all the levels of the oil to specify? Because I'm trying to tell you that there's grades in what you bring. And if you really want to push yourself, you really want to do something nice for Hashem, bring the top level. So this would seem to be a respectable way, a suitable way to learn the Rambam. Okay? In other words, there's grades, there's things, and the Rambam, the end of the halacha, ups it to the top level, says, bring the best you can for Hashem. That's why we're counting out so many different grades of olive oil to tell you can keep going up, you can hit the gold, hit the top level. However, we have to understand paragraph 3. Since this law in Rambam, basically, we've said it's a law in Yiddishkeit. It's not just about sacrifices. When we talk about bringing the choice sacrifice, which we said means intermediate level, respectable level, that's about sacrifices. That verse, Mivchar Nidrechem, your choice sacrifices, that says about sacrifices. But the Rambam extended this and said this is a law about pushing yourself not to be frugal or to withhold your resources when serving Hashem. Give the best. But that's with everything. B'chol davar, like the Rambam says, this everything that you do for the good Hashem, do it to the best. And he brings other examples. Excuse me, like building a shul, like feeding a poor person. So why does he bring this law in the laws of sacrifices and not earlier when he spoke about the laws of tzedakah? I mean, he says if you give somebody poor to eat, give him the best food. Why doesn't he put it in the laws of tzedakah, which come earlier, a few books earlier? Why does he leave it for the books of sacrifices? Actually, in Shulchan Aruch, in the Code of Jewish Law, this law that you should give a poor person good food to eat, it says in the laws of tzedakah. Or actually, we have the law also in Shulchan Aruch, in the Code of Jewish Law. Laws of tzedakah are in Yoreh there. But even in Orach Chaim, the laws of shuls, it says build a nice shul. Got to build a nice shul. Got to build it nice in your house. More than that. So why is it in the laws of sacrifices? More than that, when we talk in the laws of tefillah, the Rambam's laws of prayer, he gives several criteria, several details about how you have to build a shul. The shul should be higher than all the other courtyards in the city. So that's really where it belongs. This law that he teaches us here about sacrifices, he could have said in the laws of prayer, where he speaks about the obligation that we have when there's a bunch of Jews together, we have to build a synagogue. He could say, if you want to bring yourself to a state of merit, build the best synagogue you can. It should be nicer than your own house. And then he could have said all the other things that derive from the same law. The fat you bring for Hashem, the best you bring for Hashem. Why doesn't he say it at the first opportunity? Also, we have to understand the examples that the Rambam brings. Why does he bring in those examples in particular? Well, why not? I'll tell you why not. When the Gemara brings, the Talmud has a law that says, Zeh keli v'anveu. We read it every day in the song that the Jewish people sang at the sea. This is my God, and I will beautify him. From this, the Gemara learns, how do you beautify God? Mitzvahs are the instructions of God. Make the mitzvahs beautiful. You show that you're making Hashem, so to speak. You care about Hashem so much that when He asks you to do something, you're going to do a beautiful job of it. For example, the Gemara gives examples. When you make a sukkah, make it nice. You have a lulav, make it a nice lulav. The shofar, use a nice shofar. The tzitzit should be nice. The Sefer Torah, make it nice with a nice ink, with a nice quill, with nice handwriting. Dress it up in nice fine silks. In other words, the Gemara has various examples of how you beautify a mitzvah. It would seem that this laws that I'm telling us here is the same concept. So why doesn't he use those same examples that the Gemara uses? So, I must tell you that there's intricate footnotes here for the scholars. So much to be learned from these footnotes. There's so much cross-referencing and many big, just by the way, gives so many chidushim, novel interpretations on the intricate things that he quotes in the footnotes. But this year is just in the text, not the subtext. Paragraph 4. So we could say the explanation of all this is like this. The way it looks at first glance is that the difference between this halach at the end of the Rambam that we quoted, that bring the best from Hashem, why did they count the grades of oil? The difference between this and what the Rambam says earlier about not bringing a weak animal is that when we talk about not bringing a weak animal, that's something that has to do with the object you're bringing. In the Hebrew terminology, the chefza. The object you're bringing has to be a respectable object. Here, what the halacha we're discussing is about the person. We're saying the person has to do his very best. Are we looking at the thing? Or are we looking at the person? The halacha we're discussing says when you bring a carbon, bring it from the best you can bring. It's not about the object you're bringing. Yes, if you bring your best, the object is going to be the nicest. Of course, they go together. But what are we looking at here? We're looking at your experience, or we're looking at what's being received by Hashem. The Rambam here says, if you want to, the language that Rambam uses, somebody who wants to bring merit to himself. You know what? I'm reading this. Maybe I should say lizakot. I think actually maybe it's to refine himself. Sorry, maybe I mistranslated. Somebody wants to refine himself and bring himself merit. It probably goes together. Yakuf Yitzhara, he should bend. He should force his own instinct of withholding his resources to Hashem and give expansively. So you see, it's about the exercise that the person is undergoing in terms of overcoming his own self-centeredness and becoming centered on being on him giving to Hashem. And this is not just about the carbon. It's not about the different objects we can talk about. A carbon, a shul. It's about the person overcoming his own tendency to withhold giving for something outside of him and give. right? Whatever you do, you should do from the best. You should dig deep into yourself and give the best that you can muster up from within yourself. And we could say that this also, the Rambam kind of hints to it by saying that we're learning it from the law of menachas, of meal offerings. Um, and he also brings the proof that the Torah tells us that Hevel brought the choice animals. What he's trying to bring here is that the fact that you have to bring from the most choice that you can has to do with karbonis, has to do with sacrifices. So it's therefore not just about you bringing your best, but it's actually about the best being brought as well. And when it says that Hevel brought from the choice animals, the Rambam doesn't just say he brought, but it says Hashem turned to it. Hashem turned to Hevel and to his offering, which was choice. Because here he is emphasizing that the bringing of the carbon has to be from the most beautiful and the most praiseworthy of what he has. But it's not just about the person doing his best, but the fact that the person tries his best also has an impact on what's being brought. And that's why Hashem turns not just to Hevel, but to his gift as well. So 1 second, the Rabbi said, seemingly saying two separate things. On the one hand, he said that we can look at it as being the earlier halachas, which we said that Rambam already told us you shouldn't bring a weak animal. Isn't that the same halach is teaching us at the end about trying your best? This is not. Rabbi says, not bring a weak animal is looking at the animal and making sure the animal is respectable. At the end halacha that we're discussing, it's about the person looking into himself and seeing, is he doing his best? But the Rambam, when he teaches this halacha about the person doing his best, talks about the quality of the oil, which again is an object. He also talks about the fact that Hashem turned not just to Hevel, who gave his best, but he turned to his gift, which in other words, the Rambam here is tying the two things together, that the person has to do his best, and that expresses itself in the gift actually being best. And Hashem turns to Hevel and to his gift, which is most beautiful. There's two things being joined here, which is not necessarily always the case, which we'll see. But let's use the Rebbe's words here in paragraph 5. The explanation is like this. The difference between all other mitzvahs and the mitzvah of sacrifices is a fundamental difference. When you do another mitzvah, the main fulfillment of a mitzvah has to do with what the person is doing. In other words, there's a commandment. The main thing is not that the action has been done, in a sense. Do you think Hashem needs that action? The main thing is that the person is fulfilling Hashem's instructing and doing that action. You can only fulfill Hashem's commandment by fulfilling the instruction he gave. So if you didn't put on tefillin, you didn't fulfill Hashem's instruction. But what is the mitzvah part? It's that Hashem commanded you to do this and you did it. So it's your fulfillment of Hashem's command. And indeed, the object of the mitzvah can achieve a certain level of being included in Hashem's mitzvah. For example, there are some things that are considered actual objects of mitzvah. When you put on a pair of tefillin that's been written and made halachically, that mitzvah, that tefillin becomes an object of holiness. You can't just discard it. You can't just, it has inherent holiness. So it's become, so to speak, incorporated in Hashem's mitzvah. There are some things that are only considered an accoutrement to a mitzvah. For example, the schach, the schach we use on top of the sukkah, the branches we use to cover our sukkah, they don't become holiness, but they're associated with the mitzvah, and therefore you can't just trample them. You don't have to put them you don't have to bury them, but you have to treat them with some level of respect. There's various levels of incorporation into the realms of holiness which the object achieves. However, that's not the intention that the person has when he does it. That's a byproduct. The intention of a person fulfilling a mitzvah is doing what Hashem wants. You put on tefillin, you're not thinking, I'm doing this to bring the holiness into the tefillin. No, that's not my objective. My object is, Shem told me to put on tefillin, I put on tefillin. Automatically, what happens is, the first time I put them on, if they're written with holiness and whatever, and so they get a holiness. But I'm not there to bring holiness to the leather. I'm here to do what Hashem says, to put those leather straps and boxes and parchments on me. When it comes to sacrifices, there's a difference. With the sacraments, the actual fulfillment of the mitzvah is hinged and is all about the fact that the animal is given and becomes incorporated into Hashem's domain totally. Right? Yes, when a person promises something to Hashem to give it to the Beis Hamikdash, he's fulfilling his commandment. He's doing his part of the person, but what the full fulfillment of that mitzvah is that object becomes incorporated within Hashem's world. That object becomes Hashem's. Right? So here, when we talk about bringing a sacrifice, the main thing is the chefza, the object. You gave away that animal, it becomes Hashem's. First, the person dedicates it to Hashem. Then the Kohen actually comes and offers it on the Mizbech. It actually goes up in fire to Hashem. Say it a little bit more simply, says the Rebbe. All mitzvahs, even after the object with which the mitzvah was done, right, becomes, for example, an object of mitzvah, the person still retains his ownership. You put on tefillin, it became a mitzvah, you can't just discard it, but it's your tefillin. It doesn't become God's tefillin, so to speak. You have ownership on it. However, when you're giving something to Hashem in the form of bringing it to the Beis Hamikdash, it actually gets taken from you and it gets incorporated into Hashem's domain, property of the Beis Hamikdash, and then literally burnt up on the altar. So there's a difference here, right? Paragraph 6. And this is the difference between the regular law of making mitzvahs beautiful, which the Gemara learns from the pasuk, "This is my God, and I will beautify him." That's not the same law that the Rambam is telling us, that when you bring a sacrifice, you have to bring it from something choice. It's not the same. The law of beautifying a mitzvah is just like the mitzvah. Mitzvah is about the person fulfilling the commandment. So we're saying, do it in a nice way. Make it nice. Show that you care for Hashem. Make a nice sukkah. Make a nice lulav. Yeah. When you show that you're doing your best to beautify the mitzvah, you're showing your love, your endearment to Hashem. You're making His mitzvahs beautiful. When we're talking about bringing something nice, bringing something beautiful for a sacrifice, there's something else. It's not for you to be more beautiful before Hashem. It's because this is going to Hashem. You have to make sure that what's going to Hashem should be more beautiful. You're looking at the object that's coming up. It should be the most beautiful thing. If it's going to Hashem, it should be the most beautiful thing. Not if I'm doing something for Hashem, I should do it in the most beautiful way. But if that object is going to Hashem, it's got to be princely. It's got to be kingly. Paragraph 7. This is the reason why Rambam, where does he bring this law about karbanis? He brings it at the end. He brings it in the laws of the things that are forbidden on the altar. He brings it in the laws of the altar. Because this has to do with Mizbeach. What I'm teaching you, says the Rambam, is not just about mitzvahs, about you doing your best in mitzvahs. It's about the object being the most beautiful thing possible because it's going to Hashem. That is a Mizbeach-related kind of law. I can't teach it in the laws of synagogues. This has specific relation to the concept of korban, of something that's being taken and being incorporated into Hashem. Actually, it's even in the laws of korbanos, there's a set of laws called maasei korbanot, the actions pertaining to sacrifices, and there's another set of laws which is called isurei mizbeach, the prohibitions of the mizbeach. Says the Rebbe that this law is more connected to the mizbeach than to the act of sacrifice. The act of sacrifice is the person's act. That highlights the person's act of sacrifice. But where's the consummation of the sacrifice becoming Hashem's, that's on the Mizbeach. When it gets on the altar, that's, so to speak, when it enters Hashem's domain in a consummate way. So the Rambam wants to tell us this law that because it's becoming Hashem's, he says you got to make it, you got to open your hands wide and bring the most beautiful thing possible. This is becoming Hashem's, right? Um, so that's why it's taught in the laws of Mizbeach, because the Mizbeach is where it's, so to speak, the entryway to Hashem's domain. Paragraph 8. So now we'll also understand why the Rambam brings these particular examples about doing your best, building a shul, building a house of prayer. And he doesn't bring the examples that we brought of beautifying mitzvahs that the Gemara brings, a nice lulav, a nice shofar, and so on, a nice sefer Torah. Why? Here we're not talking about beautifying a mitzvah in the terms of a person showing that he's doing the commandment in the best way possible. Here we're talking anything that's going to Hashem. The language of the Rambam is anything, kol davar shu l'shem hakel hatov, anything that's for the good Hashem. In other words, that it is going to Hashem, do it the best way possible. Like a korban, like a sacrifice, where the sacrifice is being received by Hashem's holy domain. Do it in the best way possible. So now we're talking about a shul, or talking about making something hekdesh. A shul is for Hashem. You're trying to create a space, Hashem's space here on earth, like a miniature Beis Hamikdash. So that space should be the nicest. Not that I should try my hardest for the space. That's not the emphasis here. The emphasis here, you want the space should be as nice as possible. Of course, to do that, we have to try our hardest, but we're looking at the object here. Similarly, what else does he say? He says if you feed a poor person, or you clothe a poor person, you know what that particular form of tzedakah, says the Rogatchover, the going of Rogatchover. He says in tzedakah there's two general classifications of tzedakah. There's tzedakah that's the mitzvah, the commandment, and there's the tzedakah that's the atonement. In other words, there's a tzedakah. It's like you have a mitzvah to put on tefillin, you have a mitzvah to give charity. Then there's tzedakah which actually atones for you. It's you giving of yourself, almost like a sacrifice, and it creates a kapara. It has a sacrifice-like aspect, which I guess based on the fact what the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, to make money, you need to vest yourself fully. With money, you could have bought something to enhance your own life. When you give away money, there's a certain thing that you're giving away your life in a sense. There's an atonement aspect to it. So that's why the Rambam says this fits the same concept, that you're bringing this to Hashem. This is kind of going up to Hashem like a korban. So if you're feeding a poor person, you're clothing a poor person, with these aspects of tzedakah are similar to a sacrifice. They have the aspect of kapara, of atonement, as it says in the place where the Navi speaks about atonement and about its fasting to Hashem and about having Hashem forgive you. He uses this example. He says, give your bread to the poor. Bring the destitute to your house. When you see a naked person, cover him over. In other words, you want to talk about atonement. You want to talk about something that's sacrificial, feeding and clothing. That's why the Rambam brings those examples, because those examples are examples of things that are, so to speak, going to Hashem in a very direct way. Make sure they're the nicest. Paragraph 9. So the explanation of the connection between these two things in the halacha, which is bring your korban from the nicest. So on the one hand, it belongs to the laws of Mizbeach, which has to do with the object being as nice as possible, because that object is going to Hashem. And also the Rambam is saying, you want to bend yourself, bring from the nicest. So till now we've been highlighting that all the things that Rambam's talking about, and it's in the laws of Mizbeach, is about the object being nicest. But let's not forget that Rambam starts the halacha by saying, if you want to coerce yourself, if you want to refine yourself, dig deep and bring the best. How does that fit into what we're talking about, the object? So the Rebbe says that the completion and wholesomeness of bringing a sacrifice, which is when it goes onto the Mizbeach, this itself is what causes the appeasement to Hashem for what the person did wrong. How does the sacrifice work? Hashem gets the nicest carbon, true, but by the nicest carbon, the nicest sacrifice coming on his be'ach, this person gets appeasement. This person gets in Hashem's good graces, so to speak. And because that's the case, we want to look at the more effort he puts in, the more he bent himself, the more he forced himself, the more he put in effort to bring the most beautiful carbon. So his gift makes also the fact that makes his atonement also be that much more powerful. Because the Mizbeach is taking the beautiful thing which came as a result of his great efforts. And now those great efforts become the source of him being forgiven by Hashem. Like we find that sometimes there can be a sacrifice which goes up to Hashem, but sometimes it doesn't work as well. Sometimes there's full atonement, sometimes not. If somebody wants to really be atoned, if somebody really wants to do his best, bring your best, bring the most beautiful carbon. When the most beautiful thing goes up to Hashem, and it was through your effort, then that brings atonement, that brings pleasure to Hashem. And this is enhanced even more when we look at what's brought in commentaries. What's the intention, and how does a sacrifice work? Especially the Ramban, Nachmanides on the Torah says as follows. Ramban says the reason that sacrifices atone is because when a person does a carbon, he should think that he sinned to Hashem in his body and in his soul. And really it would be appropriate that his blood would be spilt and his body would be burnt, if just like the sacrifice that he's bringing. If not for the kindness that Hashem did, they said you can bring something in your stead. You can bring the blood of the sacrifice instead of your blood. You can bring the soul of the animal instead of your soul. Since that's the case, so we understand that the fact that you have to bend yourself and force yourself and overcome your own limitations in bringing the nicest thing is not just a side thing of the carbon. It's actually one of the main things of the carbon. This is the whole point of the carbon, is that you are being replaced by something else you're bringing, but you have to put your heart and soul into it, right? So if you bring the nicest comes to Hashem, but you've also projecting yourself into that. You've made effort. You've tried to bring the best thing, and that's really what a carbon is. Hashem's giving you a chance to bring something else instead of bringing yourself, but you're actually bringing yourself also in a way, because when you work hard to bring beyond what you would usually bring, that's looked at as Hashem as a form of sacrifice. According to this paragraph 10, says the Rabbi, we can explain why this is also learned from the oil for the meal offering. Why is the Rambam derive it from the oil of the meal offering? There's something special about meal offering. You know what that is? The concept of a carbon, if you said the concept of sacrifice is somebody gives himself over to Hashem. He forces himself not to be self-centered, but to bring his resources to Hashem. Great. When is it really true and wholesome? Is when he gives himself over to Hashem without any calculations. Beyond self, beyond calculations, he just gives himself over fully to Hashem. That's when it's at its highest point. And that's why we learn it from the meal offerings, because the meal offering says, who brings a meal offering? The Torah says, when a soul will bring a meal offering. So the Medrash says, the Gemara says, that Hashem says, who usually brings? Why is that word used? That word, v'nefesh ki takriv, when a soul brings, doesn't say by the animals or by the birds. It only says it by the meal offerings. When a soul brings. So the Gemara says, because Hashem says, who brings a meal offering? Only somebody who can't afford. He wants to bring something to Hashem, but he can't afford any of the high-level stuff like the birds or the animals. So he brings a meal offering. Can't afford a big fat ox. He's bringing the cheapest of the cheap, what he can afford. But you know what he's bringing? He's bringing his soul. Because he doesn't feel good about this carbon. He just wants to bring something to Hashem. He doesn't feel like this hot shot bringing, a big animal, a big procession. He's bringing what he can afford, but he's bringing with all his heart and soul. He feels broken about what he did and why he has to bring an appeasement. And he feels bad. He can't even bring something generous, something nice. So he's really bringing himself. So it says in chapter 11, says that so paragraph 11, through this kind of a bringing of a sacrifice to Hashem, coming close to Hashem, where he's breaking his own selfish instincts, his negativity, and he's bringing from the best carbon he can, the highest grade oil he can. He's not coming from a place of pompousness. He's coming from a place of brokenness, but he's trying to even bring the best he can. That's actually the zenith. That becomes the top level in halacha. That's the last halacha that Rambam teaches in the laws of what's forbidden for the altar, because that's really sums up at its highest level what a carbon is. That the atonement that comes through the mizbeach, which is the atonement of the soul, happens through um, this wholehearted and wholesome uh, coming close to Hashem and bring the best, even when you feel broken, but trying your hardest to bring the best to Hashem. And when we talk about mizbeach, the word mizbeach is also from the expression of atonement. In other words, it releases the bonds that have tied you up in disconnection to Hashem. But also the Mizbeach does something else. It makes you pleasant before Hashem. It makes you it makes an appeasement of you before Hashem. It allows you to make a pleasure to Hashem that you fulfilled His will. Like I say, just tell the word Mizbeach can also mean two different words. Meziach, which means it moves aside. It moves aside what? It moves aside the negative decrees that may be hovering over the Jewish people. And also a mazin. Mazin means it sustains. So the world is sustained through the fact that the Jewish people bring sacrifices on the Mizbeach. And also mechavev, Mizbeach, there's also the word can be extrapolated, mechavev, which means endearment. It makes the Jewish people beloved before Hashem. And it also mechaper, it also atones for their sins. So the Mizbeach is very powerful. And we're saying that part of the process is when a person brings his very best to Hashem. And we know that when the reasons for the destruction and for the exile go away, which is the sins are the reasons that we are in destruction, not because some big king was overpowered, so to speak, our God. No, but because we were sinful and Hashem caused for us to go into exile. When we get rid of the sins, which is the cause of the exile, then we'll be able to be redeemed through Mashiach. And then the Beis Hamikdash will be built. And especially the Mizbeach, which has to be in the exact spot that it needs to be. And there'll be the ingathering of all the exiles. And this should happen speedily in our days. Mamish. That is the sikha for today.